Okay, so we're going to be doing chapter 16, and I know a lot of you had this sheet that on the left side you should have gone agree or disagree with the statements, and we're going to talk about those statements today. So we're looking at conceptions and misconceptions about the peculiar institution, and anytime you see that title, peculiar institution, it's just a way to say slavery. So this first statement, I asked y'all, the South was the largest and most powerful slave society in the modern world. Did y'all agree or disagree with that? Disagree. Some people agree. Okay, so the reality, this is true. The U.S. was the most, and I'm going to highlight what y'all need to highlight and put in your facts. Okay? So this is true. And the reason why it's true that the U.S. was one of the most powerful is because most nations, even in Europe and in the Americas, had already abolished slavery. There's only one other nation at this time that still has slavery, which is Brazil. Cotton is also going to be the number one crop produced by slaves, and that we have in America. I cannot highlight, well, a lot of you who had me from world history understand my conundrum with this. Some of you are new and being like, what's this woman's deal? I just don't highlight well. Okay? So, what we're, like, right now, I just looked at a misconception of y'all's, right? We thought, but you have to understand by the 1830s, the abolitionist movement has taken on world, the center stage of the world. There's abolitionist conventions, which they're going to have the World Anti-Abolitionist Convention in London, and people from America will show up. But most nations had abolished slavery, okay, except Brazil. Yes, ma'am. It's the hatred towards slavery. They're against slavery. Okay? I think most of us, if we were back then, we would be an abolitionist. Okay? So the next statement. It says 3/4 of the world's cotton supply came from the southern U.S. What do y'all agree or disagree? Okay, I have both, so this is true. And the reason why 3/4 of the cotton came from the southern United States is because of the invention of the cotton gin by Eli Whitney, which y'all probably remember him from 8th grade because he also did interchangeable parts with a gun, which will be very influential in our market revolution, which we'll get to in chapter 14. But now, because of the patent he has on this, it is going to be primarily in America, and we're going to see that's why we're going to be one of the number one producing in cotton. Eventually, by the eve of the Civil War, 2 other nations will catch up to the United States, one being Egypt and one being India. Egypt, yeah. Yeah, remember when you talked about world history that they did silk eventually down there? Well, they will eventually get cotton along the Nile River because remember we talked about the Nile last year? Well, Miss Ramirez, but I talked with my kids. It predictably floods, right? So we could channel that water to be able to irrigate those fields. Okay, world history's coming back. So the next one, it says cotton has become the most important American export. Agree or disagree? This is true. By the eve of the Civil War, it represented over half of the exports. So I want you to think about the South. Is the South very influential in our market economy? Yes. And so now we're building up, you got to understand when they secede, they have to have like an ego, right? That they could do this on their own. And so a lot of their power comes from cotton. The next one, it says newspapers, banks, shippers, railroads, and governments were not dependent on the sale of slave labor. Disagree? Okay. Disagree? Okay. So this is false. Y'all were right with the disagree. Because newspapers, what they're going to do is they're going to carry advertisements for the sale of slaves. Okay. Also, I know this next one, you're like, banks finance slave trading? You have to understand that slaves are very expensive. at this time period, an average slave cost about $1,000, and you're like, oh, $1,000 is nothing. But that's equivalent to $40,000 to $50,000 today. That's the price of a new car. So most people, can they go up to a car dealership and just say, I'm going to buy that car now? No, they have to be financed through a bank. And so we're going to see banks are going to profit through this because they're going to charge interest. We're going to see shippers, and the railroads will carry the slaves to the sellers. So they're going to profit because their cargoes will be full. And lastly, the southern states and municipalities, they're going to collect revenue because they're going to tax the sale of slaves. So it's not only the plantation owner and the person of the factory that is profiting from the slave trade. We see the ads put out there, the shipping of them, the banks will finance them. So this is a system that is pretty well ingrained. The next one, it says the South was just as industrialized as the North. Agree or disagree? Y'all agree that the South was just as industrialized as the North? Disagree? Okay, so we got both. Okay, what are the stuff that we're building to industrialize a nation? Factories. What else? Railroads, roads, canals. Did we see those roads and canals and railroads in the South? So now look at this. Was the South just as industrialized? No, this is a false statement. There was no manufacturing that occurred in the South. So they are not industrialized. The railroads were not developed. They will entirely use the shipping. They will use shipping by the sea. Okay, a majority of white Southerners, 3 out of 4, 75% own no slaves. Agree or disagree? Agree, disagree? Okay, we're evenly divided, so we're going to look at that one. This is true. Slaves were expensive. What did I tell you? How much did they cost? $1,000. So slaves were expensive, so most white Southerners did not have them. Most hoped one day they could own a slave, so they defended the institution. So that means how much people in the South actually owned slaves? 25%. So over 75% of the people did not own slaves. But I know we see a lot of movies, and don't they portray that everybody, and again, that's why we have a lot of misconceptions. Most Southern farmers, we had called them yeoman farmers. Remember that from the beginning of the year? Most of them were self-sufficient. So the next one, a majority of slave-owning families owned over 100 slaves or more. Y'all agree or disagree? How much did I say a slave was worth?
Disagree.
How much was a slave worth? 1,000, which is like 40,000. So if a person were to have 100, just think about that. That's like 100 cars. That's a lot, right? So, do you think a majority of slave-owning families will have over 100 slaves? No, but when we see movies, do they portray it like that? Okay, so this is false. A majority of slave-owning families will own only 5 or fewer slaves. There's only about 2,000 families that had over 100 slaves or more. I don't know who has the Grimke sisters. Okay, the Grimke sisters family had a lot of slaves on their plantation. They were a premier family. Okay, remember William Byrd that we did at the beginning of the year? That reading we did on him? He had over 100 slaves. So we're just talking about a very small planter oligarchy that has this much. So the next statement here says the ownership of slaves provided wealth, social status, and political influence.
Agree.
Okay, y'all are confident in that one. Y'all are correct. True, planters with the most slaves often had the most fertile land, and they enjoyed the highest income, and they dominated political office. Sorry, this is just horrendous. says it was difficult for poor whites to obtain slaves. Agree or disagree? Agree? Why do y'all agree with that? They're expensive. Okay? And again, we always have this notion that everybody had slaves. But again, that is a misconception. So the next one says it was difficult for them. No, the price of slaves will increase from 1840 to 1860. So I just put there that this amount is equivalent to, I just put it a little, 1,000 to 1,800 is equal to $40,000 today. It's the price of a brand new car. A really good brand new car, right? So the next statement says the wealthiest Americans before the Civil War were the planters of the South. What do y'all think? Agree or disagree? Disagree? Some of you all agree? Okay, so some of y'all agree, disagree. We are out on this one. But what it is, it's true. The value of their land, plus their slaves, plus the price of cotton. Because at this time, America's the only one producing it. The value of their land, their slaves, plus the rising price of cotton made them the wealthiest. Okay, so this next statement after that, it says slaveholders took a personal responsibility for the physical and moral well-being of their slaves. Disagree? Okay, so again, I know I'm going to come back to my car. I told you my car did not work on Monday and I was frustrated, right? And my AC unit was not working. Did I rip out the AC unit? No. Why not? Because my car wouldn't work. And I want you to think, we have to think of slaves as property. If we do not take care of their physical well-being, will that property be able to work the next day? No. Okay? So, this is going to be a true statement. There is paternalism in American slavery. And I don't know if y'all know what paternalism means, like this fatherly affection. But the reason why paternalism occurs in America, they have to take care of their well-being, is because the slave trade will close in 1808. Do y'all remember the 3/5 compromise? That says we'll count them for 3/5 for representation in the House, which gave the South greater representation, which made the North upset because they were like, you know, why are we counting them? They're not even citizens because they're considered what? Property. But now the owners cannot get any new slaves in. So are those slaves, like, are they an investment now? And so the owner's economic interest was the survival of that human property. Because if that property did not survive, could he go and get another? No, he would have to buy, but was it expensive? So do you want to maintain? Like, do I, with y'all's cars, do y'all go get an oil change? Do y'all go put gas in it? Do y'all go fix the tire? Because if you don't fix it, what eventually happens? It becomes more expensive, right? And I know I'm referring to slaves as property, but you have to understand that their economic interest, if they lost that, would it be a big hassle for them to get a new one? So I was just like, the owner's economic interest for their survival. The next statement says pro-slavery arguments, it should be arguments, were backed by the ideas that blacks were innately inferior and slavery was the best option for them to be taken care of. Agree or disagree? And a lot of y'all know from last year we talked about white man's burden. Y'all read Rudyard Kipling's poem. And then we've talked about this whole thing when we went into imperialism. Well, those ideas about inferiority of minorities come out in this time period as well. And so we're going to see that this is true. They said slavery for blacks is what they guaranteed, perfect equality. And they said this granted equality because they would be better off than in factory work. Because factory workers had to use their wages to be able to sustain themselves, right? Food and shelter. And they said people who were slaves, I know this sounds bad, they at least had secure food and shelter. Okay, they were going to be taken better care of, right? Because if they got hurt, were they going to be helped? But if you were working on the factory line and you got hurt, was your manager going to come in and be like, oh my gosh, let's take you to the medical ward. Let me go fix your arm. Let me go take care of your family. That was not existent yet at this time period. The next one says, slaves were better off in comparison to low-wage free black labor. Agree or disagree? We're going to agree now to this. The distinction between free and is not that great. The diets of slaves were better and they had better health because, again, how are they viewing them? Are they viewing them as people or are they viewing them as property? People or property? Property. We're going to see free blacks will not have voice in politics. They were prohibited from jobs, owning firearms, and acting in their own self-defense. The closing of the slave trade is really what's going to make more owners concerned with the health and living conditions of their slaves. So who's going to be really important now because of the closing of the slave trade? Well, which one, the man or the female? Female. So when they sell them at the auctioning block, who's going to go for a higher price? Why would the female go for a higher price?
She can have
Kids, and we know that that is very important because of the closing of the slave trade. And most of us have this misconception that a man would go for more because he's going to go work on the field. But actually a woman would go for more. A very young woman, probably y'all's age, would go for more. Okay? Southern clergymen used a religious defense for slavery, argue that inequality and submission was ordained by God. Y'all agree? No? Okay.
It's probably true.
This is true. This is true. They will use the Bible. I'm just going to put, they would be using the Bible. I'm going to highlight that.
Oh, I thought it was like if it's right or not.
Oh.
Yeah, that's what I mean, sound like that.
It's okay. But several religions will divide. I already talked about the two religions, the Methodist and the Baptist. And one of the ironies is that a lot of African Americans will go to the Baptist and Methodist church in the South. But then eventually after church, they go back to their plantations and they continue their church, but they expand about what the preacher says. And do you think they're going to agree with the using of slavery? No. And this is why, I don't know if y'all know that there's the Southern Methodist and Southern Baptist church, but even then, the African American churches will split off and have their own Baptist and their own Methodist churches. And that stems from what occurs right here. And we're going to see many religions in the North are going to be against this interpretation. The next question here, or statement, it says slaves could testify in a court against a white. They could sign contracts or acquire property, own firearms, hold meetings, leave the farm, and they could learn to read and write. You already know this is false. Before they were property again, they have few legal rights. That's what I would write. They have few legal rights. And a lot of this stems from slave rebellions. We have 4 in America, but this will lead to stricter slave codes. And those slave codes will penetrate into the free whites' ability to not do much as a citizen. And so there will be some free blacks, because most of us have a notion that every black is a slave. But there's some skilled African Americans who were able to, they were welders, they were tanners, and they were able to work at night to buy their way out of slavery. But when they bought their way out of slavery, did they have to sell them higher than the auctioning price was? Mm-hmm. Yes, and so there will be enclaves of free blacks. But again, they will be limited in their ability. Okay, so free blacks could vote, enter any job, and could own firearms and serve on juries. Agree or disagree? Disagree. They were limited. That's what I would just put. They were limited. Oh gosh, I can't even highlight right. Okay. Most slaves worked in the fields. Agree or disagree? Agree. This is true. 75% of women will work on the fields and 90% of males. There's other types of jobs that exist, such as being butlers, nurses, and blacksmiths. These are the type of people, blacksmiths, who could possibly buy their way out of slavery. Cooks, coachmen, weavers, and ironworks people, these are the people who, if you would possibly see them on a small plantation or a big plantation. Big. And so eventually they would be hired out at night, and that's where they would earn their extra revenue, and eventually they could buy their way out of slavery. More slaves worked on tobacco and sugar farms. Agree or disagree? Disagree. Because most slaves will work on cotton plantations. Oh, that is horrible. And it's going to be concentrated in the Black Belt, and I know that sounds weird, but the Black Belt will basically stretch from South Carolina through Georgia, through Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and even right here in eastern Texas that we are in. And so this Black Belt is where we have the highest percentage of African Americans living. And so when I come back after spring break, we're going to talk about the civil rights movement, and it's going to take place in this concentration of African Americans, because really after the Civil War they stay in the same area, but we're going to look at them being enslaved but just by another name. The U.S. population grew from natural reproduction versus importation. Agree or disagree? Y'all agree now, because what do we know has happened? Can we import anymore? No. And we know that the slave trade, this is a true statement because the slave trade was abolished in 1808. The master had to consent to a slave marriage. Agree or disagree? Some of y'all agree? Okay. The master, the law did not recognize the legality of slave marriages. And a lot of minority groups, the law will not recognize their marriages. So some Jewish people, they did not recognize their marriages. And so groups will often create traditions to be able to create a little legality. So like with Jewish people, I don't know if you've ever seen them get married, but they put within a handkerchief a glass and they step on it, and that commences their marriage. Well, African Americans, because they could not go before court, this is where they create the tradition of jumping over the broomstick. And it's something that's very ornate that they jump over to commence that they're now man and wife. Even in Hispanic culture, there's this thing called the lasso that they put over the female and the, and that is something because in certain parts, people did not recognize the legality of marriages. And so we're seeing that because things are not recognized, we get a little bit of tradition that gets occurred. Okay. The threat of a whipping was the most powerful tool a slaveholder possessed. True, disagree? This is false. The threat of a sale, I want you to think about this. The threat of the sale was more powerful. Why would a threat of a sale be more powerful?
Because they go
somewhere worse, or they're separating them from whom? Their family. And the slave codes, they can just not, after they're done work, go out and go chill with whoever they want. There's vagrancy laws that doesn't allow them to just walk the halls of where they are. Okay, so the threat of a sale is more, and also the threat of a sale, if they threaten that the next day, can they still go work? That slave. Yes, but if you whip them, what often happens with their labor? It's slowed, or they're probably recovering. So slaves were the most involved in the Southern Baptist and Methodist churches. True or agree or disagree? Agree. This is true. They were most involved. I would just put true. The next one, slave rebellions were more frequent in other parts of the world and less frequent in the U.S. Agree or disagree? Okay, we're kind of split on this one. Okay. This one is true. There were only 4 rebellions in the United States. Okay. Stono Rebellion, which was in colonial America, which led to tougher, strict codes. Gabriel's Rebellion in Denmark Vizies. No one has those as part of their abolitionists, but I think someone has Nat Turner in our class, right? And these rebellions are, all they're going to do is put tougher slave codes. And if there's tougher slave codes, can they organize and foment a rebellion? And so in most parts of the other world, they're going to have rebellions, and that's why slavery is abolished. The most often used tool for slaves to resist was doing poor and shoddy work, slowing their pace. Most fugitive slaves were young men. Agree or disagree? Agree, disagree, we're split. So this is true. Men were young and ambitious, and you have to think about why women wouldn't do it. Most slave women were unwilling to leave their children. And if they went on the journey, having children would make the journey impossible. Okay? And so even though Harriet Tubman, most of us think we're like, oh no, Harriet Tubman did it, But did Harriet take her kids? No, she would often come back to try to get her kids. Okay, the next one. It says most slaves who fled north used the Underground Railroad. True? Okay, I want you to think about today. Immigrants coming to our nation, do a lot of them come through the port of entry? No, because what's going to happen to them? They're going to be turned back. So do they come through the ports of entry? So how do they come in?
Through the river.
Through the river, they come in illegally. Do people want to use the Underground Railroad? Because the Underground Railroad, what it is, it's a channel of homes of abolitionists. Do people know who the abolitionists are? Frederick Douglass, Theodore Weld, the Grimke sisters, right? William Lloyd Garrison. We know who these people are who are part of the Underground Railroad. And there's a fugitive slave law, right? Saying if you harbor them, people will tell you. We're going to come looking for them. So are they going to come to their houses? So do you think the slaves are going to want to use this? No, because do people know where they are? Yes. And so most of us have this notion that people do use the Underground Railroad. But again, most will manage to reach the north on their own. The Underground Railroad is going to be a loose organization of sympathetic abolitionists who helped liberated some slaves, but did people know who those abolitionists were? Yeah, and so do they know where their homes are? And so it was kind of like a big issue. If you're going to go there, will you possibly be caught with the new fugitive slave law? And so we know Harriet Tubman was a famous conductor. But again, we think of this story, right? There's been movies made about her, that this was a way that everybody got north. But in all actuality, did everybody use this? No. Because of the fear of getting what? Caught.